Welcome, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Thanks to those of you who are joining us online because we're streaming. My name is Stephen Cohen. I'm Executive Director of the Earth Institute, at least I will be for a couple more months, and I will stay being a professor here at Columbia University in the School of International and Public Affairs. I am really pleased to introduce tonight's panel on speaking science to power, the importance of facts in decision-making. That's facts in decision-making. We'll be talking a lot about that tonight. This is hosted by the Earth Institute, the Masters of Science and Sustainability Science program, our newest program, the Masters of Science and Sustainability Management program, a program that began in 2010, and the MPA in Environmental Science and Policy program, which began in 2002, and the research program in Sustainability Policy and Management. Those are all the sponsors of this evening's event. Tonight's topic is critically important, especially in a time where science and reasoning doesn't always seem to prevail. Just last week, the New York Times reported that the EPA is considering changing how it assesses scientific work in ways which could undermine most of the science, much of the science, that validates modern environmental regulations. Now, at the Earth Institute, I work at an organization where science and research are at the core of everything that we do. The Earth Institute was founded to promote the basic understanding of Earth system science and to apply that knowledge to decisions made by governments and businesses around the world. We believe it's important to do what we can do to bring high-quality analysis to bear on public decision-making and on private decision-making. The Earth Institute has a long history of this work. Our seismologists did the work of measuring and detecting nuclear bomb testing using seismic waves, which helped make the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty possible. My good friend and colleague Mark Kane and his student Steve Zebiak developed the first model to predict El Niños, and Mark found that nobody was paying attention, so he worked to create the International Research Institute on Climate and Society and the Masters in Climate and Society to make sure that people looked at that. Our Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, which is directed by Mike Gerard, who's here in the audience tonight, manages a climate deregulation tracker to identify what the Trump administration is doing to scale back federal climate mitigation and adaptation measures. Now, we live in a world that benefits from a range of complex technologies that make our lives better. But unless carefully managed, these technologies can harm our planet and its living beings, including the humankind. To manage complexity, we need to understand it, and that requires scientific research, scientific literacy, and scientific communication. We debate and argue to better understand the world, not to reinforce our ideological biases. And tonight we're going to talk about how science is used and sometimes abused in decision-making. And to do that, we brought together a terrific group of experts, and let me briefly introduce them to you. I know you should also have bios in the handouts. Tom Jorling, who has held positions on the staff of the U.S. Senate, at the Environmental Protection Agency, at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, at Williams College, and at the International Paper Company, is with us today. He was a key person in writing most of the environmental laws that we still benefit from today. Seated next to him is Sara Law, Vice President of Global Initiatives at CDP. That used to be known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, and now I understand it's just known as CDP. Seated next to her is my Columbia colleague, an Earth Institute colleague, Lerner-Lam, who's the Deputy Director of the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory and a Lamont Research Professor, and he's the Director of the new MS in Sustainability Science program. And seated next to him is Richard Moss, who's a visiting senior research scientist at the Research Program on Sustainability Policy and Management, who is here continuing the work of the Advisory Committee for the National Climate Assessment, which the administration tried to end. So before we begin our discussion, I want to just go over tonight's format. I'm going to moderate a conversation with the panelists. I'll be sitting in that chair. Then, after a while, we will have some time for those of you in the audience to ask questions. I assume a microphone will be brought to you so that people online can hear you. And I want to urge you at that point to ask questions and not make speeches, because we'd like to hear our colleagues here at the front address those questions. And then afterward, as is our tradition in the back, we have refreshments. The panelists will remain, and we can speak with each other in an informal setting. So to start off the evening and to give the audience some context on this topic, I want to ask, is my mic still working? Is this mic working? Okay, good. I'm going to ask each of our panelists, I'll start with Tom, to provide a tangible example of how you've seen science used effectively in decision-making in your own career. Tom?
Well, I think I'll break it down into two sort of levels of science involving decision-making. One sort of the macro national level, and then one that draws on the experience of being a regulator at EPA and at DEC. So if I look at the macro level, I would point to acid deposition, acid rain, where the scientific community, and it was a very narrow community at the time, developed the data identifying deposition and focusing on the source of that deposition being basically the coal-fired power plants in the Midwest. Fast forward, when I was at DEC had a scientist, Dr. Rao, who gave me a sheet that I kept in my pocket, and it identified the amount of deposition that occurred in the Adirondacks from each of 40 power plants from Alabama up through the Tennessee and River Valley, the Ohio River Valley. He was able to sort of speciate each molecule and where it came from and identify how much was being deposited. But I think acid rain was very much influenced by the data that was generated at Hubbard Brook in New Hampshire, a very long series of data over the years, and that graphic, much like the famous curve on climate change, had great impact on decision makers. With respect to a more localized or micro case, one that involves New York City, is the decision whether or not to require the New York City water supply to go through filtration, or could the water supply in the Catskills and adjacent areas be protected well enough that the water supply would be safe. And there were competing science efforts on both sides of that question. I would say those that come from the tradition of sanitary engineering insisted that the only way to assure safe drinking water for the city of New York and the metropolitan area was through filtration. But then there were others that advanced a case that involved a lot of good ecological science, I would say, that suggested no, if the land use areas associated with the Catskills were managed properly, the water supply could be safe. The difference between the two was something in the neighborhood of $10 or $12 billion to build a filtration plant versus the $3 to $4 billion that were committed to protect the watershed. So those would be two that I would point to.
Great examples. Sara?
Thank you, Steve. So I can give you an example that speaks to the work of publicly traded companies and also the investors who ultimately own them. For those of you who know CDP well, you'll know that is the space as a non-profit that we work with predominantly. Speaking first to the company example, we're finding companies, mostly the ones that we deal with, and they're the largest ones in town, they accept that setting targets around their emissions reductions are important as a tool and a strategy for helping them to think about the impact of sustainability on their businesses. However, we're increasingly seeing that businesses are accepting that good sustainability outcomes is not a nice to have, but actually a need to do because of the inherent risks presented to their operations based on them not addressing the climate change challenge. So whilst there have been many businesses over time, and we're talking about something like 89% of the companies that we track as the most important ones who have emissions reduction targets, fantastic, tick that box. What we're increasingly seeing are companies who are setting emissions reduction targets aligned with what climate science says is necessary for that company based on its contribution to the climate problem that they need to do in order to help the entire economy and therefore the entirety of society to stay within a warming level of below 2 degrees. So that's an encouraging trend that we're seeing. So of that most important sample that we track, about 43% of those companies either have what we call a science-based target in place already, or have stated that they're planning to have one on board within the next 2 years. Now, there's probably much more that they need to do, but as a starting point, that's an encouraging sign. But if I look at the other side of the ledger and looking at the investors who own these companies and ultimately who represent the many people around these rooms who actually put their hard-earned cash into these investment funds, we're also seeing an increasing awareness from the investor community that ultimately chasing short-term returns and therefore providing that signal to companies that short-termism is all that matters is a game that doesn't resonate anymore. Investors are increasingly savvy to the fact that without there being clear indicators that a company has long-term strategies to deal with large societal risks such as climate, and without there being an engaged board that shows that a company is really taking this seriously and pegging it to remuneration, as well as how a board exercises its control and discharges its responsibility to the company and to their shareholders, then we're really in a zero-sum game. A very clear example that I can give you in relation to that is the most recent communication from the head of BlackRock, which is one of the largest asset managers in the world. In fact, it manages something like $1.7 trillion in assets. Every year, the head of that company writes to the CEOs of the companies that it owns. And frankly, this year's message was stark. Unless you can demonstrate to us that you are managing long-term societal risks, such as climate change, then we will take that into account because ultimately the investors that we represent have the long-term in mind because they are investing in indices that ultimately place them in the category of being the ultimate long-term investor. You may find your lack of action represented in how you are valued and where the capital flows through to you easily in the future. So 2 compelling examples, all linked to the science and linked to the outcomes that we've seen around the Paris Agreement.
Well, we like to think that science has something to do with reality, so it's good to hear that. Art, in your experience, have you seen science have impact in decision-making?
Well, I'm a seismologist, so I study earthquakes, natural hazards more generally, but it's been particularly successful when there's been a technical decision to be made as opposed to a financial or a political decision. So you mentioned the role of science, seismology, in dealing with nuclear test ban verification. That was decisions that had to be made with respect to the ability to detect and verify the size of a test. There was also an international framework in which that decision needed to be understood, and that was, of course, the treaty organizations. Another famous example in environmental science, of course, is the Montreal Protocol, where there was a combination of academic research and industrial product research that allowed for an international treaty to be negotiated, put into force, based on the scientific understanding of the particular problem with the ozone hole. And then finally, on a more local level, again, getting back to the earthquake problem, what we see in terms of an understanding of what earthquakes do to buildings has resulted in building codes in more developed countries that essentially promote resilience, particularly in urban settings. That is a direct link between the science of earthquake ground motion, structural engineering, how buildings respond to that motion, and sets a regulatory mechanism for promoting good construction.
We unfortunately saw what happened, as we saw in Haiti, when they don't pay attention to those kinds of factors. So, Richard, we're going to start with the positives. I wanted to see if you have examples of the impact, but then I'm going to ask you to also start on why do sometimes we find decision makers wishing to ignore science, but give us a positive before we start on the negative.
Sure. So my research focuses on global environmental change issues, so things like climate change, ozone depletion, biodiversity loss, and these are really complicated decisions from a policy perspective because they involve long time frames, there's oftentimes large amounts of uncertainty, and the stakes can be extremely high economically and politically. Art mentioned I think, tremendous example that we have with the Montreal Protocol, which really was enacted within 15 years of the basic scientific insight that CFCs would cause depletion of the ozone and increase the potential for people to experience effects such as cancer or other impacts on ecosystems. And that was a 1975 article by Roland and Molina, which really talked about the role of these gases, that there was really nowhere for them to go. There was no easy way to get them out of the atmosphere. And once in, they really were going to be destroying the ozone. In the 80s, there was a very effective science policy assessment, which was international, coordinated by one of my mentors, Robert Watson from NASA, who was an atmospheric chemist. And that helped establish a foundation of science across the international community that there really was a problem that we had to think about. And then it was in roughly 1987 that there was a major campaign of observations led by Susan Solomon, another NOAA scientist. And she was the one that really detected the hole in the ozone, which within a matter of months led to the enactment or the agreement in September of '87 of the Montreal Protocol and its entering into force in January 1st of 1989. So when you think about the fact that these are gases that have no odor, they aren't visible, they have no immediate environmental impact, I think it's a remarkable accomplishment that we were able to use the science and lead to a very effective international regime.
But then, on the other hand, at the beginning of the current administration, you were involved in a certain kind of work that involved science that the decision makers in Washington seemed less interested in than they did back in the day of the Montreal Protocol. Why don't you describe for our friends here what happened?
Sure, and I just want to acknowledge Professor Cohen's leadership in enabling me to be here. I think it's a very important commitment on his part and the part of the Earth Institute and Columbia University to enable us to get this project done. So I chaired an advisory committee that was put together under the Obama administration to prepare advice for the federal government on how to improve what's called the National Climate Assessment. The National Climate Assessment is mandated by public law, and it provides information to the country, not only the federal government, but businesses and communities around the country on the potential effects of climate change and what we should do to be prepared for them and to try to limit the damage as much as possible. Under the Obama administration, I think there had been tremendous progress through the president's use of executive actions to set in place policies that focus mostly on mitigation, things such as improvements in automobile vehicle efficiency, which were perhaps in the process of beginning to undo in a very dangerous way from my perspective. But the Obama administration was also aware of the fact that even with aggressive emissions reductions, we weren't going to be able to avoid some of the immediate effects of climate change. And so he wanted to make sure that there was a basis in science for people who were undertaking things like building infrastructure that could be affected, bridges or other transportation infrastructure for water resources, even the energy grid, things that would be expected to change in their operation. Or else others, for example, people who rate public debt for its riskiness, were beginning to be interested in taking account of climate risk. If you have a city in a coastal area and you haven't developed a resilience or preparedness plan, chances are you are in a higher risk of defaulting on public debt than in fact if you had better information and were able to develop plans. So these are things that society is already beginning to act on, and what the administration, the Obama administration, wanted to do was make sure that the science that was being used to support those actions was in fact as sound as possible. What was inconceivable to me at the time was when the Trump administration came in and was very interested, for example, in a major investment in U.S. public infrastructure, that they wouldn't think that this would be an important thing to continue, that it would help make sure that the investment in infrastructure was informed by climate conditions as they were going to be, not as they had been in the past. So the ability to complete this work is really marvelous. I just want to thank Professor Cohen again for giving me the opportunity.
And if you want to see an example of not paying attention to climate impacts in building infrastructure, come to the South Ferry train station of the #1 line of our subway. The $600 million investment, which got completely destroyed after Hurricane Sandy, which was rebuilt. The next time it gets inundated, it will do a lot better. Art, let's move down this direction. Obstacles to using science in decision making.
Well, if the first principle presumption is that science matters, I've seen some failure in the process when the science inputs to the decision are not contextualized properly, where there isn't an adequate understanding of the language involved in the decision making and the other elements of the decision. But I think some of the other issues that worry me most at the moment is the fact that there appears to be a growing credibility gap in the process of science itself, particularly in a way in which ideology sometimes trumps scientific fact, and I choose that verb very carefully. The particular issue that worries me most, however, is the way in which universities seem to have lost the attributes that society would give them with respect to the respect of the output. And I think that's something we have to recover.
Thanks, Art. Sara, let me ask you what you think the obstacles to using science in decision making are.
If I pick up on the stakeholder group of companies again, I think finding confusing messages from its key stakeholders is a critical barrier to following what the clear science may say. So if we don't have clear messages from the public sector that the science is valued, and something like, doing away with the great work, of the National Assessment Committee, for instance, is a very good and clear example of it being a terrible signal to the private sector about the government's value of science. And that, can easily play into the notion that there is no sensible, rational, economic reason for business to take science into account. The nexus that I described before in terms of hearing that strong message or hearing a stronger message coming from investors is helpful, but ultimately policy matters, and having clarity as to what the science is and that public policy is in support of the advancement of it is quite important. An example I can give here is that in the data that CDP collects from the biggest companies all around the world, that sample of the most important ones that we track, many of them are really good at being able to communicate what they perceive to be short-term risks to their company and their company value. But less than half of them are able to articulate long-term risks. And without the solid scientific foundation to enable them to see it, then they won't identify it, and then that has a trickle-down effect of not revealing a complete picture for investors, so that they don't have a clear sense of how their portfolios are exposed to the risks as held in their companies.
Okay. Tom, what do you see as the obstacles to using?
Well, if we're asking what are the barriers or difficulties in penetrating the public at large, I think the questions go to questions like scientific literacy and what influences scientific literacy. I think the greatest barrier right now to penetrating the deniers, or whatever we'll call them, on climate change is ideology and religion. There's just no receptivity to the science argument or the science case. So I think those are serious when you're trying to penetrate the public at large. With respect to penetrating policymakers or decision makers, the decision there has some of the same, or the problems there have some of the same characteristics, but there's also some additional factors, and I'll call them attitudinal, and I'll use two examples. One, I worked for a senator from Kentucky, John Sherman Cooper. Only those above probably 50 here would recognize that name, but he represented the state of Kentucky. And when the smoking report came out in 1964, his attitude wasn't, I'm going to discredit the science. His attitude was, what can I do to help my farmers shift from tobacco to alternative crops? And so he spent a lot of work on the Agriculture Committee developing programs to assist in that transition. Another senator, a current senator from Kentucky, in a sense faced with the same kind of challenge, which was coal, Mitch McConnell, didn't take the attitude, how can I help my coal miners transition to a different economy, but rather to attack the science. Why that difference in those two individuals? And it was attitudinal, very much a question of how did they look at life, how do they sense the future is going to be. So that problem is a severe one. I would add on facing decision makers, the scientific community has to engage decision makers. And one of the difficulties with that is that in an area like climate change, and I used to cover climate change when I worked for a private company that was deeply involved in climate change, I was assigned to follow the COP process, the Committee of the Parties, or whatever that acronym stood for. And I would go to those meetings, and they were scattered about every 6 months or 8 months. And each time I went, the jargon changed. It had become so specialized that the only people that could understand the language were the people involved in the sort of the scholarly pursuit of climate change. And that sort of left the public behind. And I think that's a major concern. It's a barrier that sometimes the scientific community becomes so deeply involved in their own language and in their own perception of the issues, is that they lose the ability to bring the public and, in many cases, the non-scientific public policy decision makers along with an issue. So the scientific community has to engage. I can tell you that one of the most important relationships that led to the Clean Air Act in 1970 was the relationship that Howard Baker, a Republican senator from Tennessee, had with the director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a guy named Alvin Weinberg. Weinberg came to Baker's office probably twice a month, and they would just sit down and talk science. Partly because before he became a lawyer, Howard Baker was an engineer. But Alvin Weinberg took advantage of that relationship. Obviously, there was an important reason for that. The National Lab is dependent upon financing from Congress, and so there was a reason for it. But engaging with public officials on the part of the scientific community is very important, and it should not be withdrawn from.
Interesting set of points. I mean, what's interesting to me is this whole issue of risk, and we all benefit enormously from what science and technology has given us, whether it's the computers we keep in our pockets, or climate control, or travel, or all of the things that technology has given us. At the same time, it's clear that these technologies have increased the risk to the planet and to human health, and this is something that needs to be managed if it can be. So, Tom, we'll start with you and work our way down on this whole issue of risk. How is uncertainty and risk brought into decision making, and how does it get factored into both the public and private sector as we think about the future? Because nobody can predict the future, but we have to base our current actions on some projection of what the risk would be of taking that action in the future. And so how is this information from science brought into risk assessment? And what have you seen, how have you seen that change over time, and what's your general assessment of this issue?
Well, I can really only speak to the perspective of sort of a regulator of activities that can result in challenges to safety and health. And there was widespread acceptance of the idea that you had to have some sort of assumptions about dealing with risk, and to deal with that risk you develop these kinds of techniques. Margins of safety. So you say, okay, the science says basically here's the health effect at this level, but we don't know whether that's the perfect place, so you add a margin of safety onto that. The Clean Air Act specifically calls for applying a margin of safety in the setting of ambient air quality standards. More popularly in Europe is the precautionary principle. You basically, instead of having a burden of proof on those who want to regulate, the burden of proof is in effect on those who are going to be regulated. So you develop a kind of, what the word implies, precaution. Another way that the regulator uses is very conservative methodologies. Now, conservative not in any way political, but in conservative in the use of animal testing, in the application of different techniques, so that you basically build in very, I guess, margin of safety kind of orientation. One of the ways, for instance, we used to call it the case of the killer tomato, when we were trying to establish cadmium levels in sludge for deposit on agricultural land. What was a safe level of that cadmium? Well, the methodology that was used was extremely conservative. That level of sludge was applied to land in agricultural area outside of Chicago for 70 years. That area then became a suburb, and when that became a suburb, each person in that suburb had a garden, and they grew tomatoes, and they consumed the entire product of that crop of tomatoes themselves. And then the determination would the cadmium level rise to a level that would produce renal dysfunction. Very conservative assumptions through that process, leading to the level that was then set for cadmium concentrations in sludge before it could be applied to agricultural land. So those are some of the techniques that a regulator deals with risk, but I'm sure there are others that argue those conservative assumptions are so biased against the technology that they should not be applied.
Interesting. So Sara, thinking about risk and uncertainty and the use of scientific knowledge as it affects risk and uncertainty in private markets, how does the private sector think about these issues?
So Steve, I thought that this was a really fascinating question. And I think that the underlying assumption that I want to outline is that the private sector doesn't shirk away from risk. Risk is fine. And in a free market economy, you can have different companies who may want to take on a conservative versus a more radical approach to how they work with that risk to create additional value, the margin for company A versus company B. So that's the preface. But unfortunately, uncertainty, on the other hand, is the worst friend that a company could have. And when you have uncertain policy or wildly swinging signals that companies and investors are exposed to, that creates the environment of uncertainty, which makes it really difficult to do business and to do it well, and therefore to return value to ultimately the beneficial owners of our private enterprises around society. So, why does science help? I feel like I'm a broken record here, but the striking thing that we found at the end of 2015 and at the beginning of 2016, when the Paris Agreement was firmly settled upon in December, and then speedily ratified the following April, in fact the fastest international convention to be ratified in history. We found that our business constituents responded really, really well, because it actually gave a very solid scientific and, frankly, political foundation for which they could understand the parameters of risk and therefore find an ingenious way to continue to make money in the long term and return value to investors on that basis. If I fast forward to the more recent history within the United States, it was gratifying and frankly slightly surprising to find that notwithstanding the announcements from the federal administration that the United States intended to pull out from this Paris Agreement that I've just referenced, nonetheless business came forward and redoubled its message that they found the Paris Agreement to be helpful. They would continue to plan their business by and large according to it, and that they would stay in the picture. Largely these are businesses that understand that they're tied to a global economy, whether they're headquartered in the USA or headquartered in Europe or Australia, my home country. They work in a globalized economy. So we found that science has actually been helpful in providing the right parameters for assessing risk.
Well, Mike Bloomberg went around saying we're still in, and
Exactly.
We've got states and corporations to do that. So, Art, let me ask you about this. In the world of science, uncertainty and debate about risk and everything else is part of the dialogue. It's part of how scientists learn. And so when that uncertainty gets communicated to decision makers, as we're seeing today, it seems to undermine, in some people's minds, the science itself. So how does a scientist approach this idea that we have uncertain science, we're still debating things, even things that we're relatively certain about, there's still debates about. How do you present that to decision makers without undermining the very basis of the science itself?
That's a critical question, Steve, and I resonate a lot with what both Tom and Sara have said about the notion of risk, that there needs to be some perception of risk and perception of a reduction of uncertainty in some way. You can sort of, in a very cliched way, say that science is directed toward reducing uncertainty. And so as science progresses, as we build our knowledge capital, as it were, we should be reducing uncertainty. Often, however, that is not well communicated. And so there's kind of a supply side issue here, which is are we doing enough to transmit the process of quantifying risk in ways that are understandable in a decision-making context, in a way that uses the language that's necessary for making a decision, basically using the risk metric in that way. So I think that's a failure on the part of scientists themselves to not acknowledge that there's this need to communicate that language, to communicate the process itself. But we also have to remember that there's the demand side as well, which is how people perceive risk. And I think what we face, particularly with climate issues, is that we're looking at an emergent risk that we are asking people to spend money or to spend capital, whatever you want to call it, social capital, financial capital, now, in order to reduce the risk sometime in the future, and that's naturally discounted. And we haven't really begun to understand how to communicate that.
It puts it at a disadvantage with other environmental issues that you can see and smell, for sure. Richard, your perspective looking on this issue of risk and scientific information.
Yeah, well, I agree fundamentally with what Art said, that I think in many ways the science community has not as effectively communicated what it means by the concept of uncertainty, particularly in the context of decision making. When we talk about uncertainties related to climate change, I don't think that many scientists at this point would say that there's uncertainty that humans are having an impact on the climate. The level of uncertainty is not sufficient to block movement on mitigation. It seems to people that that's really something that we understand pretty well. A colleague of mine and I, Steve Schneider, worked very hard within the context of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to try to instill some procedures and approaches for more effective communication. And rather than talk so much about uncertainty, we encourage scientists to talk about their level of confidence in findings. And what contributed to the level of confidence, whether it was high or low, and in particular what remaining research needed to be done in order to increase that level of confidence, particularly with respect to a specific decision context. And I think that that's something that has been applied and where we have made some progress. Each of the successive IPCC assessments has continued to refine that approach. One other point that I want to make is that uncertainty is pervasive. People make decisions under uncertainty all the time. And I think that one of the mistakes that we've let occur is to not push people on the fact that, sure, there's uncertainty, but what you do when there's uncertainty, how do you make a decision or not, that really goes back to what Tom was talking about earlier. It's about people's values. Are you or are you not risk averse? What do you care about? Do you care about the consequences of inaction, or do you feel that the consequences of action are worse? And a lot of that, as he pointed out with the example of coal mining, is about where you sit in the value chain of coal mining and energy production, and who benefits from that and who doesn't. And it seems to me that that's a critical part of the debate, is getting people to recognize uncertainty is pervasive, it exists, we make decisions with it all the time. The question is, where are your values with respect to uncertainty, and how does that lead you to act or not act?
Well, the panel knows I have other questions, but I'm going to hold mine off and see if there are any questions from the audience that we can start to address as a group. So if we have questions, somebody raise their hand and we will try to address them. We have people okay, we have somebody in the middle here. I was going to say, I've never seen a group this large that didn't have a question.
Hello, is this mic working?
Yeah.
I was wondering, in terms of like policies, both nationally and internationally, but ideally, what sort of like policy decisions would the members of the panel like to see enacted?
About what topic?
About like primarily climate change, but in terms of like science, like research and science-based policy in general.
Okay. If you had a magic wand,
I'll pass the
we'll start with
moment.
Richard. What would you do with your magic wand?
Well, I would, start, I think, by being upfront about my own values in this situation and saying that my values do affect what I would like to do about climate change. And I'm concerned about climate change particularly for two reasons. One, that I see an unequal distribution between the benefits from not acting, from keeping, for example, the same energy system that we have in place and not moving towards renewables. The concentration of benefits for people who take that kind of approach it's really very high, and it's a limited number of people, whereas the effects and the risks of climate change are widely distributed, and particularly for people who haven't contributed a great deal to the problem in developing countries. So for that reason, as a first reason, I'm inclined to think that we really need to accelerate movement away from fossil fuel energy, increases in energy efficiency, and those were many of the things that the Obama administration was in fact trying to put in place, and I think through some of their actions they've helped to create a market environment that will make it difficult to move backwards from those things. And then, I think that there's another component of this that just has to do with the potential for irreversible changes and surprises. From my perspective, and I'd be very interested to hear Art's views on some of this, there are real uncertainties and surprises with respect to the climate change issue, things that we may pass that we may never be able to come back from, that we have to be worried about, whether it's changes fundamentally in the operation of the Earth system or losses of biodiversity that would be associated with that. And to me, that puts an extra importance on the issue of a approach that takes a great deal of care, precautionary principle.
Mark?
So to this point, the issue of thresholds or so-called tipping points is really relevant. What financial mechanisms do we have to prepare for that? Is there some sort of continuum of policies that would allow us to worry about that, but being precautionary may be the best way to proceed? But if I were waving a magic wand, I would ask the Securities and Exchange Commission to internalize externalities and basically price in and require companies to
Put it into the accounting
to
system.
basically quantify the entire spectrum of risk, including environmental risk.
Okay, Sarah?
I'll probably start with how the decision on policy is made before I come to a couple of the choice things, and I'm with Art on this one as well. I want to start with the how the decision around policy should be made, because frankly, no two political economies are the same. And what tools we need to use to address the climate issue in, town A versus town B is starkly different. So if I had my choice, then I would make climate and environmental considerations a need to do as opposed to a nice to have when we're dealing with education policy, when we're dealing with health policy, when we're dealing with public housing policy, when we're dealing with transportation policy, with energy policy, and frankly every other thing that our governments around the world have responsibility to provide guidance and regulation for. Because ultimately, if we continue to speak about environmental detriments and environmental problems within the rubric of only the environment, then we're missing a trick. Because there are co-benefits to be experienced when we broaden out the debate and we broaden out who is in that debate and who has a stake in it, than the way we are doing right now. But to give you a few things, like on my wish list that I think would be common to most national governments and international governments, absolutely internalizing an externality such as pollution, so placing a price on carbon is a really important thing. And in this country, as in many, carbon pricing is a scary debate. We get sucked into this conversation about a carbon tax versus a cap and trade scheme. But there's more than one way to put a price on carbon. There are policies out there that implicitly therefore place a price on carbon. One way or the other, let's just get on with doing that. So that would be one. Number two, I'd like to also, do more of what Richard was talking about before, creating the market conditions for our wholesale change in how we use energy. So there's been a lot done to make renewable energy price competitive, which is fantastic. But I'd like to see us tackling the issue of subsidies for fossil fuel. That again is a great non-equaliser in the energy space right now. And that could be a really interesting game changer in the energy space. And then finally, you'd expect me to say this, but if you have to measure something, then you'll be able to manage it. And if you manage it, therefore it will be governed. So I'd like to see all the regulators in the world, not just the SEC, coming up with mandatory reporting by the private sector on how they manage environmental risk, recognizing that it is a material and relevant risk to be reported so that investors can understand how it affects their portfolio, and it's got to be done now.
Okay.
Very good.
Tom.
I'll pass.
Okay. So let's take another question, if we have one, up here in the front.
A couple of questions, please. I'm curious about the role of the scientific advisor, if that's the correct term, within the administration currently, and her voice, and its historically in the past.
You mean the person who hasn't been appointed yet?
Yes, exactly. But a larger question, perhaps, is that the panel is concentrating largely on risk issues around climate and environmental issues. I'm curious the degree to which the scientists here would want to weigh in on concerns that recently deceased Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk and others have raised regarding the rapidly changing technological environment that we're entering into, especially as it concerns artificial intelligence, and whether we, or you, I should say, as a scientific community, really have voicing that is in any position to sort of raise red flags of caution around issues like this.
Interesting question. Anybody want to take that up? We're all looking to Art as the Deputy Director of the Observatory.
Well, I think there are a couple of layers to that question. Let's take the science advisory structure, first of all. John Marburger, who was previous science advisor, had a very compelling statement about the nature of the scientific input to what is essentially a political process in decision-making. And he was arguing against what many people would call a technocracy, essentially decisions that are made purely on quantitative estimation of a particular problem or quantitative understanding of a particular problem. There are always political considerations entering into real policy. And that's something that I think the scientific community has been slow to acknowledge, and is one of these issues having to do with the way in which we use our language of science to interact with policymakers. With respect to the second part of your question, with respect, are we concerned about some of the technological developments? Of course we are. The issues having to do with the right sorts of regulation are front and center with a lot of what is being developed technologically. Tom Friedman had a wonderful column earlier this week in which he basically said we're essentially into the second inning, if you will, if I remember the metaphor correctly, it being the putative start of the baseball season. The first inning was basically the new technology coming up with the internet, the interactive social networks, and so on. Is that being properly regulated, and are we now dealing with the unanticipated consequences of being so well connected? That's a regulatory question. It's really a question of philosophy about how we adjudicate those sorts of issues. It's not necessarily just a scientific question.
Steve, I can just add a little bit of information because I maintain pretty close contact with colleagues in the government. And, you know, first, I think it is a disappointment that there has not been a science advisor named, because having a science advisor, a person who can give voice and leadership in this arena, is extremely important. Having said that there really are a lot of good people at the level of sort of the permanent government, if you will, the deep state, who are in fact working very hard on a set of science and particularly technology issues. I think that there is a sense that the administration is interested not so much in science but in the technology side of this, and that there are people who are working on technological issues and how the government can in fact move tech policy forward. So I think that we should take some measure of comfort from that even though there isn't a leader in the office, there still are people who are doing the work of the office.
I think the spirit of your question, though, is one that we should all be thinking about, which is we all benefit from the science and the technology. Ruth DeFries, one of our colleagues at the Earth Institute, has written a book called The Big Ratchet, which is about how humans continue to feed themselves even though it looks like there's going to be too many of us, we'll never be able to do it. And the absolute reduction in extreme poverty from 200 years ago to today. 200 years ago, we spent all of our time trying to find food, clothing, and shelter. That was the norm in human existence. And today, technology has freed us from it, but at the same time, there is this dependence on science and technology that means that in some ways we're not as free as we might have been otherwise. So we're exchanging freedom for something else. And I think it is an issue that we should be thinking about, so I thank you for that. One of the things that I always do is I never go late, and we're actually at the end of our time, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to have a last word on a piece of advice for students or scientists, professionals, on how they can contribute to or think about the use of science in decision making. And Tom, I think I'm going to start with you on this.
Well, that's always a challenge, but basically it might even sound like a cliche, but my advice to students, whether or not they're science students or not, is to stay very curious. The pace of change is so great that I taught at a liberal arts college, and I would advise the students to go into the library and browse through Science magazine, browse through Nature magazine, browse through Scientific American, not pretending that they're going to understand some of the detailed research articles, but there are always news sections in those magazines, and just staying abreast of what's happening and what's going on in the scientific world, because it's moving at a very rapid pace, and citizens' obligations are to at least have some familiarity with it and some way of linking that to their daily lives and to their advocacy, whether it be voting or not. But staying curious and getting exposure to the tremendous wealth of information. And I don't say Wikipedia can do it. I think it's better to go in and look at the hard copy and just browse through it and see how those linkages come about with what you're doing, and you'll see material in there. So I think it's not very fundamental, but staying curious is the most important thing that I think a student can do as they leave the academic community and move into life.
Thank you, Tom. Sara.
What a question. But thank you. You gave us some pre-warning, so I have had some thought about this. I'd like to leave all of you in the audience with a message of optimism. We started the conversation today having a discussion about values. And in the work that I do, hopping around the globe, working with companies often and investors often, I've yet to meet a CEO or an executive chairperson who actually wants to leave a planet that is not fit for the purpose of human habitation for their grandchildren or their grandchildren's grandchildren. So from a values perspective at the individual level, I have a great deal to be hopeful about. What I'm now seeing is that in my travels, I don't have to turn to the Paul Polmans or the Elon Musks around the world in order to find a receptive ear when it comes to how do you continue to be profitable in the future as a business whilst being able to do your part to help us to exist within our planetary boundaries. So we're very much so seeing a trend where the private sector is moving to the how, not the why. And so for those of you who are coming up through their careers, whether you be scientists of the physical sense or scientists from the social science sense, please continue doing what you're doing, because I think that what you have to contribute is very important, and the future world, professional world that you're stepping into will value you for the studies that you're pursuing now.
Thank you.
Art. Well, I think if everybody took our master's courses, we'd be in great shape. I think, but more fundamentally, I share.
That's
Sara.
the MS in sustainability science that
we
we're
have
starting?
we have a capacity issue. But I share Sarah's optimism. Science is a wonderful field. What's happening in science, particularly environmental science, is amazing with respect to the new observations being made, The laboratory techniques that we are applying, the ability to use so-called big data, understand all these different parameters coming. We're understanding the planet as a system of systems. What's missing in that is the ability, almost linguistically, to get into the decision or the policy-making process in ways that matter. And I think if students can combine their sense of wonder at what we're able to achieve in our understanding of the planet with an understanding of the context, there's that word again, in which decisions and policies must be made at the individual level, at the local level, the international level, then I think we will have achieved something.
Richard, you have the last word.
Well, other than saying what they said, it seems to me that it's crucial that you have facts on your side. If you're trying to argue for something in public life or a decision, facts matter. We haven't talked about fake news tonight, but the phenomenon of making things up, motivated or unmotivated, that aren't simply true is really worrisome to me. So I would urge people to be solid in their facts as they argue for something. But then the second part of that is don't expect the facts to make the decision for you. That's about your values. Don't forget your values.
Thank you. I have two more pieces of business. First, I want to thank our panel and ask you to join me in thanking them. And just as importantly, I want to invite everybody to join us in the back for refreshments and some informal conversation. Thanks for being here tonight.